You're not tired. You're disconnected from yourself. You slept last night, maybe even for 8 hours. You took the weekend off. You sat still, scrolled through something mindless, did nothing that required effort. And yet, this morning, you woke up tired. Not physically exhausted, something else. A kind of heaviness that sleep doesn't touch. A flatness that rest doesn't fix. You go through the motions, coffee, routine, the first task of the day, and somewhere underneath all of it, there is a quiet, persistent sense that something is missing, not from your life, from you. That feeling is what this video is about, not burnout in the clinical sense, not a productivity problem, not something a vacation will resolve, though you have probably tried that too. This is about something quieter and more specific, something that has been building slowly in the background for longer than you may realize. A distance between you and yourself that grew so gradually you stopped noticing it was growing. Here is the thing nobody tells you about exhaustion. There are two kinds. The first kind comes from doing too much. The body runs low on resources, the nervous system gets overwhelmed, and rest restores what was depleted. That kind of tiredness makes sense. It has a clear cause and a clear solution. But the second kind doesn't respond to rest. It doesn't improve with a lighter schedule or a weekend away or a good night of sleep. It persists regardless of what you do externally, because its source is not external. It comes from living day after day at a distance from your own inner life, from suppressing what you feel, from performing versions of yourself that no longer feel real, from carrying the accumulated weight of everything you never let yourself fully experience. The Stoics had a word for the state they considered most essential to human life. Not happiness, not success, not even virtue in the abstract sense. They called it returning to yourself. Marcus Aurelius wrote about it not as a philosophical ideal, but as a daily necessity, something he had to actively practice repeatedly against the constant pull of external demands. In the Meditations, Book 4, Paragraph 3, he described the interior retreat as the only place where genuine rest was available. Not the absence of activity, the return to one's own ground. Carl Jung approached the same territory from a different direction. He observed in Modern Man in Search of a Soul that the greatest and most important problems of life are fundamentally unsolvable. They are never solved. They are outgrown. And the outgrowing, he argued, requires something most people spend their lives avoiding. Contact with the interior. Honest, sustained, uncomfortable contact with what actually lives inside you rather than the managed surface you present to the world. What you are feeling, this tiredness that doesn't have a clear cause, this flatness that doesn't lift even when circumstances improve, is not a malfunction. It is information. It is the self-communicating something that the mind has been too busy, too defended, or too distracted to hear. And what it is communicating is not complicated. It is simply this: you have drifted, not from your goals, not from your responsibilities, not from the life you are supposed to be living. You have drifted from yourself, from the interior ground where your actual experience lives, from the part of you that feels things genuinely, wants things honestly, and knows without having to be told what it needs. The distance between you and that part is what is making you tired, not your workload, not your circumstances. The distance itself. And the reason that distance is so hard to close is not because closing it requires dramatic change. It is because closing it requires something quieter and more difficult than change. It requires stopping long enough to feel what you have been moving away from. That is where this conversation begins. You rest, but you never recover. Think about the last time you genuinely felt restored after resting, not just less tired, actually restored. That specific quality of returning to yourself after a period of stillness, clear, present, reconnected to what matters. If you are honest, that feeling has become harder to find. You rest, but something in you stays activated. You sleep, but the heaviness is still there in the morning. You take a break, and when the break ends, you realize it didn't actually reach whatever needed reaching. This is the first signal most people misread, because the logic of rest seems obvious. If you are tired, you stop, you recover, you continue. That equation works for physical depletion. The body knows how to restore itself when given adequate time and conditions. But what you are experiencing is not physical depletion, and the restoration it requires cannot be delivered by sleep or stillness or the absence of demands. The exhaustion that doesn't lift after rest is not a resource problem. It is a distance problem. Here is what that distance actually feels like from the inside. You go through your day completing tasks, meeting obligations, responding to people, maintaining the surface of a functioning life. And all of it happens at a slight remove. Like you are present in body but not quite present in experience. Like the day is happening to you rather than being lived by you. You finish the evening and realize, with a vague sense of unease, that you cannot identify a single moment when you were fully there. That quality of absence, that sense of watching your own life from a slight distance, is not tiredness. It is disconnection, and it produces a fatigue that is structural rather than physical. A fatigue that accumulates not from what you do, but from the continuous low-level effort of maintaining function while something essential in you remains untouched and unheard. Epictetus wrote in the Discourses, Book 1, Chapter 1, that the things within our power include our inner responses, our orientations, our genuine reactions, our actual relationship with our own experience. And the things outside our power include the circumstances we move through. The exhaustion that rest cannot fix is almost always produced by inverting this, by managing circumstances with full attention while leaving the inner response entirely unattended, by running the external life at high capacity while the interior life runs on something close to empty. You have probably noticed this inversion without naming it. The moments when you are most productive are often the moments when you feel most absent from yourself. The days that look most successful from the outside are sometimes the days that feel most hollow from the inside. That hollowness is not ingratitude. It is not weakness. It is the self registering accurately that the life being lived on the surface is not fully connected to the life being felt underneath. And that gap between what you show and what you carry, between what you do and what you actually feel about what you do, is where the real exhaustion lives. Rest cannot close that gap. Only one thing can, and the first step toward it requires understanding how the gap opened in the first place. You learned to function disconnected. At some point you became very good at something that nobody taught you and nobody praised you for. You became good at continuing when you were not okay, continuing when something inside you needed attention you didn't have time to give, continuing through the discomfort, the doubt, the quiet inner signals that something wasn't right, not because you were careless about them, but because stopping to address them didn't feel like an available option. Life had requirements. People were counting on you. The schedule didn't pause because your interior life needed tending, so you learned to compartmentalize, to separate what you feel from what you do, to move through the day with sufficient functional capacity while keeping the emotional interior at a manageable distance. And over time, that separation became so practiced, so automatic, so deeply embedded in how you operate, that you stopped experiencing it as separation at all. It became simply how you function. This is what high-functioning disconnection looks like, and it is far more common than anyone acknowledges, precisely because it is invisible from the outside. From the outside, everything looks fine. You work, you respond, you show up, you handle things. You are, by every external measure, a person who has it together. And that appearance is not false. The functioning is real. But underneath it, at a level that the daily performance doesn't reach, something has gone quiet. The inner life, the part of you that feels things genuinely, responds to things honestly, and knows what it actually needs, has learned to wait, has learned to operate in the background, has learned somewhere along the way that its signals are not urgent enough to interrupt the surface. Jung described this dynamic with precision in his work on the persona, the functional identity the psyche constructs to navigate social and professional life. The persona is not false. It is a real adaptation, a necessary one. The problem arises when the persona becomes so developed, so consistently reinforced, that the distance between it and the actual self becomes structural. When the mask is worn so long and so well that the face beneath it begins to feel unfamiliar. The specific experience of this is something most people recognize when it is named directly. You are in a conversation, performing the conversation well, present, engaged, saying the right things. And somewhere underneath it, you are watching yourself do it. You complete a day that looked, by every measure, like a successful day, and feel nothing about it. You receive something you worked for and notice with a quiet confusion that it doesn't land the way you expected. That gap between the performance and the feeling is not cynicism. It is not ingratitude. It is the signal that the part of you doing the living and the part of you doing the feeling have become disconnected. That function has continued while presence has quietly withdrawn. And the most disorienting aspect of this state is that it begins to feel normal. The disconnection stops registering as absence and starts registering as just how things are, which means it no longer generates urgency, no longer produces a clear signal that something needs to change. It simply becomes the texture of daily life until the tiredness becomes impossible to ignore. You stopped listening to yourself a long time ago. It didn't happen in a single moment. There was no day when you decided to stop paying attention to what you feel. No conscious choice to set aside your own inner signals in favor of what the external world required. It happened gradually, incrementally, in small, barely noticeable moves away from what you were actually experiencing, each one justified by something reasonable, each one too small to register as significant. Something bothered you, and you let it go because the timing wasn't right to address it. Something disappointed you, and you moved on quickly because dwelling on it felt unproductive. Something didn't feel right, and you overrode the feeling because you couldn't afford to slow down. These are not dramatic moments. They are ordinary ones, the kind that accumulate across months and years without ever being catalogued as loss. But they are loss. Each small override is a minor act of not listening, and minor acts of not listening, repeated consistently enough over time, produce a particular kind of interior silence, not the peaceful kind, the kind that comes from a self that has learned through repetition that its signals will not be received, that what it communicates will be acknowledged and then set aside in favor of whatever is more pressing, and a self that has learned this stops communicating as clearly, retreats, goes quiet in a way that is easy to mistake for calm. That retreat is what the emotional numbness is about, the flatness, the sense of moving through days without anything quite landing. These are not symptoms of depression, though they can become that. They are symptoms of a self that has been consistently overridden for long enough that it has stopped insisting. Seneca addressed this pattern with a directness that still carries weight. In his letters to Lucilius, letter 1, he wrote that we must claim our time back for ourselves, reclaim it and control it. His concern was not with distraction in the ordinary sense. He was pointing at something more fundamental, the way a life fills up with the demands and expectations of others until the interior, The actual self, with its actual needs and responses, is left with almost no space to exist in. The overriding of your own inner signals was not selfishness to avoid. In most cases, it was the opposite. It was the responsible thing, the mature thing, the thing that allowed you to function within the demands of a life that required your consistent presence and output. You overrode yourself in service of things that genuinely mattered: relationships, work, obligations, the lives of people who needed you. But the cost of that sustained self-override is real, and the cost is not paid all at once in a single, recognizable moment of crisis. It is paid slowly, in the progressive dimming of inner responsiveness, in the growing distance between what you experience and what you allow yourself to feel about what you experience, in the tiredness that has no single cause, because its cause is not a single event, but an accumulated pattern, years of choosing function over feeling, output over inner contact, continuation over pause. You stopped listening to yourself a long time ago, not because you didn't care, because caring about everything else seemed more urgent, and eventually the body begins to say what the mind refused to hear. Your body is responding to what your mind ignores. The body does not argue. It does not negotiate. It does not wait for a convenient moment to deliver its message, and it does not soften the message to make it easier to receive. It simply responds. And when the interior life has been ignored for long enough, the body becomes the only channel left through which the self can communicate what the mind has been too defended to acknowledge. This is what the strange tiredness is, not a medical mystery, not a character flaw, a communication, the body registering with the only language available to it that something has been running on insufficient resources for too long, that the gap between what you feel and what you allow yourself to feel has grown wide enough to produce a physical cost. That cost takes different forms in different people. For some, it is chronic fatigue that rest doesn't resolve. For others, it is a persistent tension in the body, jaw, shoulders, chest, that has been there so long it stopped registering as tension and became simply how the body feels. For others, it is a kind of emotional flatness, a dulling of response, the sense that things that should move you no longer quite do, that pleasure, when it arrives at a reduced volume, that the range of what you feel has narrowed without your permission. None of these are mysterious. They are coherent responses to a coherent situation. The nervous system does not distinguish between emotional suppression and physical threat. When emotions are consistently overridden, when the interior signals are repeatedly generated and repeatedly unaddressed, the nervous system registers that as a condition of ongoing stress. Not acute stress, chronic low-grade stress, the kind that doesn't produce obvious symptoms immediately, but that accumulates in the body over time as a continuous background activation that the system cannot fully discharge because the source of it is never actually resolved. Jung wrote, in Modern Man in Search of a Soul, that the psychological contents which are excluded from conscious life continue to exist in the unconscious and to exert an influence on consciousness. He was describing precisely this. What you suppress does not disappear. It relocates. It moves from the conscious to the physical, from the acknowledged to the embodied. The emotions that were not allowed expression find another form of expression. And the body, honest in a way the mind often isn't, carries what the mind refused to hold. You have probably felt this specific honesty in your body without fully understanding what you were feeling. The moment your stomach tightens before a conversation you have been telling yourself is fine. The heaviness that settles in your chest in circumstances that should feel neutral. The inexplicable exhaustion that arrives not after physical effort, but after sustained emotional performance. After a day of being the version of yourself that functions well and feels nothing inconvenient. These are not weaknesses. They are accurate readings. The body knows the distance between who you are and how you are living. It has always known, and it has been trying to communicate that distance in the only way available to it, through sensation, through fatigue, through the persistent physical signature of a self that is not being fully inhabited. But here is the question that the body's communication eventually forces. Why did that distance develop in the first place? Why did you learn to live so far from your own interior? The answer to that is not a failure. It is something that made complete sense at the time. You adapted to survive. The disconnection was not a mistake. That is the first thing to understand, and it is more important than it might initially seem. Because the way most people relate to their own emotional numbness, their own inner distance, their own pattern of overriding feeling in favor of function, the way they relate to it is with a quiet, persistent judgment, as if the disconnection were something they chose carelessly, something that reflects a lack of emotional intelligence or self-awareness. But that is not what happened. What happened is that you adapted, and the adaptation was intelligent. It was appropriate to the conditions that produced it. It was, in the truest sense of the word, a survival response. At some point in your history, and for many people this begins earlier than they realize, the environment you were navigating required more functional capacity than emotional availability, more output than inner contact, more performance than presence. The demands were real, the expectations were real, the consequences of not meeting them were real, and the most effective way to continue meeting them was to develop the capacity to function without being slowed down by what you were feeling about the functioning. So you learned to move through discomfort without stopping, to manage emotional signals rather than follow them, to keep going when the interior was asking for pause. These were not failures of self-awareness. They were successful adaptations to environments that rewarded continuation and penalized vulnerability. The psychological mechanism underneath this is what Jung described as the construction of the persona, the functional self that learns to operate effectively within the demands of the external world. The persona develops precisely because the full interior self, with all its complexity and need and genuine response, cannot always be present in every context that life requires. Some degree of managed presentation is not pathology. It is social intelligence. But the persona, Jung observed, becomes a problem when it hardens, when it is no longer a flexible adaptation that the self can move in and out of, but a fixed structure that the self lives inside of permanently. When the distance between the managed surface and the actual interior becomes so habitual that the person loses easy access to the interior itself, not because the interior disappeared, because the pathway to it was rarely used, and unused pathways become difficult to find. This hardening almost always happens gradually and without a clear moment of decision. You were not protecting yourself dramatically, you were adapting practically. Each small choice to suppress, to continue, to manage rather than feel, was a reasonable response to a real demand. The accumulation of those choices is what produced the distance you are now navigating. Marcus Aurelius understood this tension with unusual clarity. He governed an empire, an environment that demanded, continuously and without relief, the highest levels of functional output. And yet throughout the Meditations, Book 2, Paragraph 4, he returned again and again to the necessity of inner honesty, of not allowing the external demands to consume the interior entirely, of maintaining, even in the middle of the most overwhelming external pressure, some thread of genuine contact with the self beneath the role. That thread is what many people lose, not all at once, gradually, in the same way the disconnection developed, incrementally, quietly, through the accumulation of adaptations that each made perfect sense in the moment they were made. The adaptation protected you. That is true. But what protects for a season can confine over a lifetime, and the self that learned to survive by going quiet has been waiting, with more patience than you perhaps deserve, for the conditions to finally be safe enough to speak again. The question is whether you are ready to hear it. You have been living as an edited version of yourself. Somewhere along the way, without a deliberate decision and without a clear moment you could point to, you began performing your life rather than living it, not performing in a dishonest sense, not consciously constructing a false version of yourself to deceive others, but performing in the deeper sense, presenting a curated, managed, socially viable version of yourself so consistently that the distance between that version and your actual interior experience became structural, became the default, became eventually so familiar that you stopped experiencing it as distance at all. This is what Jung meant by the persona becoming a cage rather than a costume. The persona, the functional identity that mediates between the interior self and the demands of the external world, is a necessary development. Every person who operates in social and professional life has one. The problem is not having a persona. The problem is forgetting that it is one. Forgetting that beneath the version of yourself that responds to emails and manages relationships and handles what the day requires, there is another version. Older, less polished, less strategically coherent, but more real, more genuinely yours, and progressively harder to access the longer the persona is worn without relief. The specific experience of living as an edited version of yourself has a texture that is immediately recognizable once it is named. You are in a situation that should feel significant, a moment of connection and achievement, an experience you have been anticipating, and you notice with a quiet confusion that you are watching it rather than inhabiting it, that the part of you that should be fully present is somehow behind glass, observing, registering, but not quite touching the experience directly. You smile at the right moments, you say the appropriate things. The social surface of the interaction is entirely functional, but somewhere underneath, the actual you, the one with the unmanaged response, the genuine reaction, the real feeling about what is happening, that version is not in the room, or it is in the room but muted, present but not permitted to be present in full. That gap between the performing self and the feeling self is one of the quietest and most consistent sources of the exhaustion that rest cannot fix. Because maintaining the performance, even when it has become automatic, requires energy, and the energy it requires is drawn from precisely the source that most needs to be replenished, the interior life itself. Epictetus made a distinction in the Enchiridion, chapter 17, that applies directly here. He drew the line between the role assigned to you by circumstance and the self that plays the role. The role is external. The circumstances that shaped the persona are external. But the self, the one doing the playing, that is internal. That is yours. And confusing the role with the self, inhabiting the role so completely that the self behind it becomes inaccessible, is precisely the loss he was pointing at. You began editing yourself for reasons that made sense: social acceptance, professional function, emotional safety. The edited version was more manageable, more predictable, more accepted by the environments you needed to navigate. And so, you wore it, and eventually stopped taking it off. Sometimes you smile, keep the conversation moving, finish the day without incident, and feel that you were not really present in any of it. That feeling is not malfunction, it is recognition. It is the actual self-noticing accurately that it has been absent from its own life for longer than feels comfortable to admit. And what happens when you finally stop and let the silence arrive is the thing that most people spend enormous energy avoiding. The silence reveals what distraction hides. You already know what happens when the distraction stops, not intellectually, in your body. in the specific quality of discomfort that arrives in the first few minutes of genuine stillness, before you reach for the phone, before you turn on something to watch, before you find a task to redirect your attention toward. In that brief window, before the next distraction is located and engaged, something surfaces, not dramatically, not with the force of a crisis, quietly, like a presence that has been waiting just outside the door, patient and persistent, for the moment when the noise finally drops enough to be noticed. That is what you have been managing around, not boredom, not restlessness in the ordinary sense, something more specific and more personal, the accumulated interior, the emotions that were not processed, the needs that were not addressed, the parts of yourself that were set aside in favor of continuation, all of it waiting in the silence for the attention that the activity of daily life consistently deferred. This is why distraction is so effective and so exhausting at the same time. It works. It genuinely works. The phone produces enough stimulation to interrupt the surfacing. The task provides enough engagement to redirect attention before the discomfort can fully arrive. The conversation, the scroll, the next thing and the next thing and the next, they are all functionally effective at keeping the interior at a manageable distance. But they are effective the way a dam is effective. They hold back what is accumulating. They do not reduce what is accumulating. And what is held back continues to press. The exhaustion you feel is partly the energy cost of maintaining that pressure management, of living at a continuous low-level vigilance against your own interior, of keeping yourself busy enough, stimulated enough, engaged enough that the silence never quite arrives with its full weight. Seneca wrote in his Letters to Lucilius, Letter 2, that a person who is everywhere is nowhere. He was speaking about the mind that moves constantly from one thing to another, never settling long enough to actually be present in what it is doing. But the observation runs deeper than distraction in the modern sense. He was pointing at the cost of perpetual motion. The way a life lived in continuous movement away from stillness never develops the interior depth that genuine living requires, because here is what the silence actually contains. Not emptiness, not the painful confrontation most people imagine when they picture stopping the distraction and facing what is underneath. What the silence contains is information. Honest, accurate, personal information about what you actually feel, what you actually need, what actually matters to you beneath the layer of what you are supposed to feel and need and care about. The discomfort of silence is not the discomfort of darkness. It is the discomfort of truth arriving without a filter, of the interior self speaking without the managed translation that the performing self usually provides. And truth without a filter, even when it is not painful, requires a different kind of engagement than the curated surface of daily life allows. Most people, when they encounter this discomfort, interpret it as a problem to solve. The unease of stillness becomes evidence that something is wrong, that the silence is dangerous, that the feelings surfacing in it are too large, too inconvenient, too destabilizing to be allowed full presence. And so the distraction returns. The phone is picked up, the noise is restored, and the self waiting in the silence retreats again, patient and persistent, to wait for the next window. But here is what changes when you stay with the silence long enough to actually hear what it is saying. What surfaces is not catastrophe. What surfaces is you. The actual you, unmanaged, unedited, with the genuine responses and the real needs and the honest relationship with your own experience that the performance of daily life has been systematically covering, and that you, the one waiting in the silence, is not the problem. It is the solution. The reconnection with it is exactly what the exhaustion has been asking for. The question is not whether you can tolerate the silence. The question is whether you are willing to stop fleeing from what it has been trying to show you. Marcus Aurelius called this the interior return. Marcus Aurelius was not writing the Meditations for publication. He was writing them for himself. Private notes, composed in the middle of one of the most demanding existences imaginable, leading a vast empire through wars, plagues, political betrayals, and personal losses that would have broken most people entirely. He was writing them because he needed to, because the external demands of his life were so relentless, so consuming, so structurally opposed to any form of genuine interior attention, that he had to deliberately carve out the practice of returning to himself against the continuous pressure of a world that required him to be always outward, always responsive, always present to everything except his own interior. What he kept returning to across the length of those private notes was not philosophy in the academic sense. It was a single, repeating orientation. Come back. Whatever has pulled you outward, however long you have been absent from your own interior, return. Not dramatically, not through grand self-examination, through the simple, practiced daily act of turning attention inward, of locating beneath the noise and movement of the external life the ground that does not shift when circumstances do. In the Meditations, Book 4, Paragraph 3, he wrote that nowhere can a man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul. He was not describing a pleasant experience that came naturally. He was describing a practice that required deliberate effort precisely because the default direction of life is outward. Because attention, left to its own momentum, moves toward the external, toward demands, toward stimulation, toward the continuous input of a world that does not pause to ask whether the interior is keeping pace. This is what makes the Stoic concept of interior return so different from what self-care has come to mean in the modern sense. It is not about comfort. It is not about replenishment in the way a bath or a vacation replenishes. It is about a fundamental reorientation of where the self is located, about recognizing that the life being lived on the surface, the functional, performing, managing life, is not the whole of you, and that the part of you not contained in that surface life is not a problem to be solved or a wound to be healed. It is the actual ground of who you are, the interior from which genuine presence, genuine response, and genuine rest all originate. The exhaustion that doesn't lift after rest is, in this framework, a navigational signal. It is the self indicating that the return has not happened, that the outward direction has been so sustained and the interior so consistently unvisited that the ground beneath the surface life has become unfamiliar, not gone, not damaged, simply unvisited for long enough that the path back to it requires conscious effort to find. This is not failure. In the context of modern life, with its structural bias toward output, visibility, productivity, and continuous external engagement, the absence of interior return is not a personal failing. It is almost the default condition. The environment does not support the practice. The culture does not reward it. The schedule does not accommodate it. And so it requires, as it required for Marcus Aurelius in an entirely different context, a deliberate choice made against the natural momentum of how life tends to organize itself. The Stoic understanding of strength is relevant here in a way that most people miss. Stoic strength is not the capacity to endure everything without showing the cost. That is not strength. That is suppression given a philosophical justification. Real Stoic strength, as Marcus Aurelius practiced it, is the capacity to remain connected to your own interior, even under the maximum pressure of external demands, to not lose yourself in the performance of your own life, to maintain, however thinly, the thread of genuine contact with the self beneath the role. Because that thread is what makes genuine rest possible, not the absence of demands, not a quiet schedule, the return to the interior ground from which real restoration comes. And reaching that ground requires something that most people find harder than any external challenge they have ever faced. You will have to feel what you avoided. This is the part nobody is eager to hear, and it is the part that matters most. Everything explored so far, the exhaustion that rest doesn't fix, the high-functioning disconnection, the body communicating what the mind ignores, the persona worn so long it became the default, all of it has been circling a single center. A single thing that the reconnection requires, and that the entire architecture of avoidance has been constructed to prevent. You are going to have to feel what you spent years not feeling. Not all at once, not in a single overwhelming confrontation with everything accumulated, but genuinely. Without the management, without the override, without the immediate redirection toward function that has been the habitual response every time something difficult began to surface. You are going to have to let some of what has been waiting in the silence actually arrive, to sit with it, to allow it to be present without immediately moving to contain it or explain it or convert it into something more manageable. This is what reconnection actually requires. Not a new routine, not a different schedule, not a reframing of how you think about your life. Contact. Direct, unmediated contact with the interior that has been operating at a distance for so long that feeling it directly now carries the particular discomfort of encountering something both deeply familiar and almost forgotten. The emotions that have been suppressed are not dangerous. That is important to say clearly, because the fear of them, the implicit assumption that what has been contained must be contained for a reason, that allowing it to surface will produce something unmanageable, that fear is often what keeps the distance intact long after the original conditions that made the distance necessary have passed. Jung addressed this directly in Modern Man in Search of a Soul, when he described the therapeutic process not as the elimination of difficult emotions, but as the integration of them. The emotions that have been excluded from conscious experience do not disappear in the exclusion. They become part of the unconscious, where they continue to exert influence on energy levels, on mood, on the persistent quality of low-grade exhaustion that has no identifiable cause. Bringing them into awareness does not amplify them. It metabolizes them. It allows the psyche to do what it was designed to do, process experience and release it, rather than holding it indefinitely in a state of suspension. There is a specific experience that many people recognize at this threshold. You stop the distraction. The silence arrives. Something begins to surface. A sadness, an old grief, a sense of loss that doesn't attach clearly to any single event. A tiredness that feels older than any particular circumstance of your current life. And the first instinct is to move away from it, to find something to do, to decide that now is not the right time, that this is too much, that there is something more pressing that needs attention. That instinct is the avoidance completing its own logic. And recognizing it as avoidance rather than wisdom is the threshold moment, because the feelings waiting in the silence are not a threat to your functioning. They are the evidence of your depth. They are proof that something real has been happening in you beneath the surface of what you have been performing, and allowing them presence, not wallowing in them, not being consumed by them, but genuinely permitting them to exist without immediately engineering their removal, is the beginning of closing the distance that has been producing the exhaustion. Maybe you are tired because you have spent years trying not to feel, and the rest that actually restores is not on the other side of more management. It is on the other side of finally allowing what has been waiting in the silence to be met with the presence it has always deserved. Who did you become while trying to survive? There is a question underneath everything explored in this video, a question that has been present since the beginning, waiting for the right moment to be asked directly, not as an accusation, not as a judgment, as an honest invitation to look at something that most people spend enormous energy not looking at. Who did you become while you were busy surviving? Not who you are in the abstract sense, not the values you hold or the person you aspire to be, but concretely, the version of yourself that emerged from years of adaptation, suppression, performance, and continuation. The self that was shaped not by deliberate choice, but by the accumulated pressure of environments and demands and relationships that required specific things from you and received them consistently at the cost of other things that were never asked about and never offered space. Because surviving changes you, not always dramatically, not always in ways that are visible from the outside, but in the quiet interior, in the range of what you allow yourself to feel, in the things you stopped wanting because wanting them seemed impractical, in the opinions you softened and the needs you minimized, and the parts of yourself you allowed to go quiet because the world you were navigating didn't have room for them. In all of that, the shape of who you are shifted, gradually, without announcement, in the direction of what was required rather than what was real. And at some point, the distance between the person who survived and the person who existed before the surviving becomes large enough to feel, not as a clear before and after, more as a vague sense that something is missing, that the life you are living, functional and coherent as it is, does not quite fit the interior it is supposed to contain, that you have become, through no single decision and no identifiable failure, someone slightly foreign to yourself. This is the existential weight underneath the exhaustion, not just the tiredness of doing too much, the deeper tiredness of being, for a long sustained period, someone other than who you are, of living in the gap between the self that adapted and the self that was adapted away from. That gap has a cost, and the cost is paid in precisely the currency that has been running low: presence, aliveness, the capacity to be genuinely moved by your own experience. Marcus Aurelius returned to this confrontation throughout the Meditations with a consistency that suggests he understood how easy it is to lose oneself inside a life that demands everything. In Book 10, paragraph 8, he wrote that it is not death that a man should fear, but he should fear never beginning to live. The living he was pointing at was not biological, it was interior, the quality of genuine presence in one's own experience. The difference between moving through a life and actually inhabiting it. The question of who you became while surviving is not meant to produce guilt. Guilt would be the wrong response entirely, because the becoming was not a moral failure. It was a human one, the most human one. The self that adapted, that learned to function at distance from its own interior, that developed the persona and maintained it, and built an entire operational life around it. That self was doing the best it could with the conditions it was given. It deserves acknowledgement, not judgment, but acknowledgement is different from continuation. Recognizing who you became in the service of survival is not the same as deciding that person is who you have to remain. The adaptation made sense for the conditions that produced it. The question now is whether those conditions still exist, whether the distance that once protected you is still necessary, whether the version of yourself that learned to survive by going quiet still needs to be quiet, or whether the silence it learned has outlasted the threat that originally required it. There is a part of you that existed before the adaptation deepened, before the suppression became structural, before the persona hardened into something more cage than costume. That part did not disappear in the surviving. It went quiet. It went interior. It has been there the entire time, waiting with a patience that is itself a kind of testament to how fundamental it is. And it is still waiting, not for conditions to be perfect, not for the external life to arrange itself into something that finally feels safe enough. It is waiting for you to turn toward it with the simple, honest recognition that it exists, that it matters, that the distance between you and it is not a permanent condition, but a practiced one, and practiced distances can be closed. You don't need to become someone else. Everything in this video has been moving towards something simple, not easy, simple. A single reorientation, that does not require you to dismantle your life, reinvent your identity, or achieve some state of emotional completeness before you are allowed to feel like yourself again. You do not need to become someone else. You need to return to someone you already are. That distinction matters more than it might initially appear, because the way most people respond to the recognition of disconnection, once they allow themselves to fully feel how far they have drifted from their own interior, is with a kind of ambitious self-improvement energy, a determination to change everything, to become more present, more authentic, more emotionally available, more this and less that, starting immediately, through deliberate, sustained effort. And that determination, though it comes from a real place, is often just another form of the same managing energy that created the disconnection in the first place. Another project, another performance, another way of relating to the self as something to be optimized rather than inhabited. Reconnection is not a project, it is a return, and returns are different from projects. A project moves towards something new. A return moves towards something already present, already real, already yours. Something that has been there the entire time, beneath the adaptation and the performance and the years of overriding what you felt in favor of what was required. The self you are returning to is not a future self you have not yet become. It is the self that exists right now, underneath the distance, waiting not for transformation, but for attention. Marcus Aurelius understood this, with the clarity that came from practicing it under the most difficult possible conditions. He did not write in the Meditations about becoming a better emperor, a wiser philosopher, a more virtuous person in some abstract future tense. He wrote about returning, about the practice of coming back to his own interior ground, repeatedly, in the middle of everything the external life demanded, not achieving a state, returning to one. In Book 6, paragraph 11, he reminded himself simply to go inward, not as a destination to be reached, but as a direction to be practiced. The practice of return does not look dramatic from the outside. It does not require a life overhaul or a period of isolation or a set of techniques performed at a designated time. It looks like small moments of genuine contact with your own interior. Like pausing in the middle of an ordinary day and actually asking yourself what you feel about what is happening. Not what you think about it, not how you should respond to it, but what you actually feel. And then staying with the answer long enough for it to be real, rather than immediately converting it into something more manageable. It looks like noticing when the performing self has taken over completely and there is no part of you present in your own experience, and choosing in that moment not to fix it or judge it, but simply to register it, to let the noticing itself be a form of contact. It looks like tolerating the discomfort of silence without immediately filling it, like allowing something to surface without immediately deciding what to do about it, like meeting the self that has been waiting in the quiet with the same quality of patient attention you have spent years directing outward toward everything except yourself. The opposite of emotional exhaustion is not energy. It is not motivation or enthusiasm or the sense that life has become newly interesting. The opposite of emotional exhaustion is connection, the specific interior quality of being present in your own experience, of feeling what you feel without management, of moving through your days as the actual self rather than the edited version. That connection does not require your life to be different. It requires your relationship with your own interior to be different, more honest, more patient, more willing to let what is real be real, without immediately moving to contain it or correct it or convert it into something more socially viable. You are not tired because you did too much. You are tired because you spent too long living at a distance from who you actually are. And the way back is not forward into some improved version of yourself. It is inward, toward the self that has been present the entire time, waiting with more patience than you perhaps knew you had earned. The return begins not with a decision to change. It begins with the simple, honest recognition that you have been away, and that somewhere beneath everything you adapted into and everything you performed and everything you survived, you are still there. You always were.